Three Essays on Sexuality is a famous monograph, one of the earlier ones by Freud. This monograph came out around 1905, in a way, just after Interpretation of Dreams. Interpretation of Dreams is 1899, 1900. And then we have this Three Essays on Sexuality. Here we see for the first time Freud trying to consolidate his findings till now. Whatever he found in terms of human sexuality and human pathology and how the two correlate, that it's a kind of a consolidation, also a development. Very early writings in hysteria, we took a look at component instincts. And now here, the component instincts are brought together to be under an overall genital organization. So in one sense, it's a consolidation. In another sense, it's a development. In a third sense, it is also introduction of something very important, what we call the psychosexual stages, the oral, anal, and the phallic stages. So all of that happens in this monograph. Psychosexual stages are introduced in this monograph, but they are not actually very well developed. The development of psychosexual stages happens much later, partly by Freud and in fact partly by many others who later reflected and developed the ideas of psychosexual development. But we see the roots of the core Freudian theory coming up here. And later on, Freud would go into the significance of the Oedipus complex and develop the theory much ahead, and then go on to the life and death instinct. But here we see the early Freud in a seed form coming up completely. So if we look at early Freud and the late Freud, the early Freud who talks about psychosexual development and the Oedipus, and the late Freud who talks about death instinct, the life and the death instinct, then the center of the early Freud, or the central nucleus of the early Freud, we see in this essay, Three Essays on Sexuality, this monograph. Now this monograph has three parts. The first part is sexual aberrations. Second part is infantile sexuality. And third part is transformations at puberty. So we will slowly take a look at each of them. Let us go into the foundation of what he tries to say in this monograph. Freud makes the first point in his preface that this is not a complete theory of sexuality. It is not even a complete theory of human sexuality. And it is a theory of sexuality as limited to psychoanalysis and pathogenesis and healing. So this is an idea of human sexuality that Freud developed when he was in touch with pathology and trying to understand roots of pathology and trying to understand how healing happens involving sexual phenomena, or the outcome of healing affecting sexual experience. So sexuality as a cause of pathology or healing of pathology resulting in something in the sexual area being gained by the person, healed in the person. So this is the second point he makes, that this is a theory of sexuality limited to his explorations of pathology and which involved a lot of infantile observation or deduction of what happens in the infant's mind. The third point that Freud brings up is he quotes Haeckel's famous principle that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And by what he means is that in an oversimplified way, if we look at embryo evolution, the evolution of the embryo from the first month to the ninth month, in some sense, depicts the evolution of the species in a long evolutionary process. And that principle, when you apply to the human mind, many things come out. The first thing that comes out is that the psyche is not an advent in the world, it is an evolved entity.
What is meant by advent in the world, sir?
Advent is avtaran. That it is not that it is a first time phenomena which has suddenly happened in the world. It is not an advent in the world. It is not an entry into the world. It's not something parachuting down. It is like in a long process, something is evolving. So it is not a sudden entry and advent in the world. So the psyche is not an advent, but an evolved entity. And that would mean one of the outcomes of this is that there is a reptilian mind and a mammalian mind below the human mind. That we have these parts in the psyche, that a deeper part of us is probably reptilian, above it is probably mammalian, and above it is probably human. In a rough oversimplified way, we have traces of our evolution. This is one important part. The second important outcome of this principle is that the mind cannot be tabula rasa. So there are two fundamental ideas about the human mind. One, that the human mind at birth is a completely blank sheet, what they call the tabula rasa, a completely plain blank sheet, and experience writes over it. And whatever experience writes in the earliest parts of our life, that then creates the fundamental formats or fundamental templates or schemas from which we respond to the world. This is the classical belief of those who are on the behavioral side of things. So the behavioral belief is that the mind is blank and experience writes over it. And all there is in the mind is what experience wrote very firmly in the early parts of the life. The second outcome is that, so if we go by this idea of evolution, then the mind is not a blank slate. The mind already comes with some kind of a pre-design, that there is a design in nature. And the mind already comes with something preformed, some tendencies, some learning, some experiences, some orientation. It's not a blank slate. That is one. Now, if it is not a blank slate, then what is there? One thing that can be there is the part of it is reptilian, part of it is mammalian, part of it is human. And there always will be struggle between the three. That the reptilian part, or probably even a pre-reptilian part, is always looking out for danger. Yeah. So the pre-reptilian part probably is always looking out for danger, and that would mean that catastrophic thinking would be very natural and almost universal. The fundamental fear of survival always will be there. The living in a group, the herd mindset will always be there. And if the reptilian part is there, then kill or be killed will always be there. And if the mammalian part is there, then caring for the infant for a very long time, having a very long dependent childhood and helpless childhood, all of this will be there. And therefore, these are parts which are inbuilt into the hardware if we go by the evolutionary principle. The second outcome of this principle of evolution goes even deeper, which Freud does not talk about this at this moment, but comes much later in the late Freud, when he again comes back to the life and the death instinct. And here he says that life has come from matter and mind has come from life. And whenever there is a force that drags you, pulls you ahead, there is a force which opposes it and wants you to drag back to its primal state. So there is a constant pull of inertia. So mind has a constant pull of life to cease the activities and go back to the pre-mental level of life. And life has a pull to cease being life and go back to the pre-life stage of being inanimate matter. And the inanimate matter also will have a pull to go back to pure inertia. And the idea from this comes is the idea of life and death instinct, which comes out much later in late Freud. But we can link it, if we put early and late Freud together, we can link it here. That the moment you bring in evolution, that the past, that the present is evolved out of the past, and the present has traces of the past, and the past in some way is still active, the present is not free of the past, then all these concepts naturally flow out of it. How do we look at equilibrium then? Because all psychobiological phenomena involve equilibrium. If there is one substance, chemical, which increases the heartbeat, there is a second chemical which reduces it, and the two in coordination, they arrive at some sort of equilibrium. So equilibrium is something we see everywhere, in the biological system, in the physical systems, in the psychological systems. And what we see in nature is that we don't have a single intelligent self-controlling force which can create equilibrium. Rather, we see equilibriums achieved by two opposing forces. And the same principle here would be that psychic equilibriums essentially are progressive balance between a life and death instinct. And what happens when the balance goes completely on one side? If normalcy of mood is a balance between life and death instinct, then mania will mean too much of life energy and too little death energy to neutralize it. And depression will mean too much of death energy and too little life energy. So this is what flows out of some of the foundational concepts he talks about. Then he comes to the, yeah, please.
Can I go back a bit?
Yeah.
I am tempted. I think that this reptilian mind is somewhat similar to id. Mammalian mind is ego, and human mind aspires to be the superego. May not be completely applicable, but
Yeah.
child, parent, adult.
Correct. So if we just refine it a bit, I think the logic is largely right that id has the highest proportion of the reptilian mind, a little less of the mammalian mind, and even lesser of the human mind. The ego has very less of reptilian part, but it has a large part of human part and a considerable part of the mammalian part. And if you look at superego, then it's predominantly human and somewhat mammalian. So it will be like, if you look at id, it will be 70%, 20%, 10%. If we look at ego, it will be like 70% human and 30%, sorry, 60% human and 40% mammalian. And if you look at superego, we will be looking at 75% human and 25% mammalian. So those proportions are there.
Yes.
And that is why the contest is always there between the superego and the id. That the person who indulges in corruption very well knows the corruption is wrong. He just can't control his desire. So there is frontal cortex is very clear what is right and what is wrong. It is just that the frontal cortex cannot control the impulses which are coming from more primitive part of the brain. And that more primitive part has probably more of the earlier parts of evolution. Similarly, in the reflex action also we see that in reflex action, we have very large component of our ancestors. And we also see in groups that once the group is taken over by the unconscious mind, you can't control the mob.
Yes.
Because once the mob is controlled by their unconscious mind, majority of people in the mob, you can't reason with the mob in the control of the unconscious. And
Regress quickly.
correct. And Freud says that it's very delicate balance that we maintain where we remain civil. So civilization actually exists on a very delicate foundation. Anytime the foundation can be breached and the pre-civilizational elements can take hold of us. So he talks about it in Civilization and its discontents. That what we call civilization actually is skin deep. You scratch the surface and the animal comes out roaring.
Yes.
That the civilization is only skin deep, and that's one of the ways is just look at history. And we cannot find 50 years in human history where brutality is not there. Aggression, domination, sadism, brutality, barbarism, it's very much a part of us. And it's with great effort we control it. And the moment it becomes too much, it just explodes and we see the brutality all around.
Yes.
There's a very good poetic line on this. It's by Dunkard. Says, "Thy hand, great anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all." Thy hand, great anarch, the anarch which is roaring to go, which is silent only for a few decades, and after it again comes up. The
What is the
anarch,
first word, sir? Thy rent.
thy hand,
Thy head.
head, thy head, thy head, hath. Thy hand, great anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all. So that Freud recapitulates in a different way that the civilization is very precarious, and we see all around in the world the brutality taking over, which means the frontal cortex is still not able to control the more primitive parts on a longer span of history.
Yes.
It can control, but the control is not of transformation, it is of repression. And the repressive control is a very precarious control. When it exceeds a particular point, it explodes.
Thank you.
So the first thing after the preface and the general introduction it comes to is the sexual aberrations. So slowly he's getting into human sexuality. The first thing he addresses is criticism that he is extending sexuality too far, too wide. That the pervasiveness of sexuality in human psyche that he is talking about is an overstretch. That the stretch of sexuality in the human psyche is too much that he is doing. So he answers to those critics with two quotations, not quotations, two references. He brings in Schopenhauer, the pessimistic philosopher of Europe, who said that we just don't want to look at it, but human sexuality is a motivation or an influencer in human affairs far more than we actually see. That in an unconscious way, the sexuality is active in so many things that we find it difficult to see. And the second, he talks about Plato, that Plato talks about the eros of the divine, and the eros of the divine pervading the Platonic world. And through the Platonic world, obviously having an impact on the real human world. So he makes references to two of them, Plato and Schopenhauer. And what he says is this. He says, for it is, this is directly Freud, original, for it is some time since Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, showed mankind the extent to which their activities are determined by sexual impulses, in the ordinary sense of the word. It should surely have been impossible for a whole world of readers to banish such a startling piece of information so completely from their minds. And as for stretching the concept of sexuality, which has been necessitated by the analysis of children and what are called perverts, we'll come to it again, what Freud calls pervert in his own day and age. Anyone who looks down with contempt upon psychoanalysis from a superior vantage point should remember how closely the enlarged sexuality of psychoanalysis coincides with the eros of the divine Plato. So he marshals two facts to his defense, because at this stage he is accused of stretching sexuality too far in the psyche. That sexuality may not be involved in pathogenesis of so many pathologies that he is talking about. And he is answering them. And before he answers them, he brings up some concepts. And these concepts are couched in language which we don't use today. So these are some words we have to actually learn. The first word is called inwards. Now, what is invert is actually somebody who has an inversion of sexual interest, what we call homosexuality. So what today we will call homosexual, in his time, the word used was inwards. Invert is a person whose sexual interest has inverted from a man to a woman or woman to a man. Second, he uses the word, which is not used anymore, amphigenic inverts, like amphibious, like that, amphigenic inverts, meaning bisexuals. These are inverts who have inverts, which means a kind of a deviant. So the first meaning of the word invert is somebody who has an inverted sexual interest in terms of gender. And second meaning is deviant, who deviates from the norm. So he calls the earlier Freudian era word for homosexuality was one of the words, not the word, but one of the words was inverts. Second is amphigenic inverts, meaning bisexuals. Then he talks about contingent inverts. These are bisexual or homosexual under compulsion, like you put somebody in prison and you lock up only men or you lock up only women, and after some time they go homosexual. And when they come out, they can give up the homosexuality and return back to heterosexuality. So they were bisexual or homosexual under compulsion. And this he calls as contingent inverts. And these are the words which Freud does not use as his language, but this is the language of his time. And he mentions it in the monograph by saying that people talk of these concepts, inverts, amphigenic inverts, contingent inverts, and what they say is that this inversion, this deviation is nothing less than a sickness. There is some sort of a biological or neurological problem. That is why it is happening. Because this is not at the service of reproduction, and therefore it is a deviation from evolution. Because the first biological law is that every species has to look for its own survival and reproduction. So any action which is in variance of this fundamental law of nature, is a sort of deviation. So at that time, it was understood that this kind of deviation happens because of two reasons. One, there is a genetic problem, or because of some reason, the neurological system is degenerating. That the causality of this is innate and degenerate. So this was discourse of his time. So the first discourse related to the sexuality not being pervasive enough in the mind, sexuality determining very few things in the mind. And the second was related to any movement away from heterosexuality. And Freud disagrees with both of this. Freud says that one, sexuality pervades far more areas of the psyche than we would like to accept. And two, that he talks about that what we call inwards, or not we call, but it was called then, what was called then inwards or deviants actually is very natural. So Freud is now bringing bisexuality and homosexuality within the range of normalcy. He's not calling them anymore innate and degenerate. It is still innate. He's not talking still like a modern woke, but he definitely does not call it degenerate. He does not call it deviation. So what does he say? First, he talks about bisexuality, and he says bisexuality in human nature is supported by both biological and psychological observations. That in both genders, there are many hormones, many biological entities which are common. And in both genders, there is the contrapart of the other. That there is masculinity and femininity in both of them. That man also has masculinity and femininity, and women also has masculinity and femininity. Not exactly Freud's words, but this was the intent. He also talks about bisexuality being very common in tribes where anthropologists went and saw that in some of the tribes this was very common. So it is not completely unnatural. It is not only a product of the Christian civilization or the Islamic or the Judaist civilization. It's not just Semitic civilization, it is found even in tribes. Then he talks about elites, that elites in all the societies have far more bisexual dispensation in experience of life than the normal population has. And he says this is no degeneration. So this is how Freud starts with the concept of sexual aberration, and how he does not think what in those times was thought to be an aberration to be an aberration. He then goes to the preferences of non-heterosexual nature. So first he talked about the homosexual or bisexual preferences. Then he goes into other aberrations, as it was called then. Having interest in having sex with children, having sex with animals, anal sex, oral sex. All this, according to those days standards, were deviations. By today's standards, we would say children and animals we would still hold as deviation. But rest of it has been incorporated into culture by and large as normal. So, while talking about aberrations, Freud upholds a few aberrations of his times, while other aberrations he reclassifies into normals. And he will again come back to the idea of anal sex, oral sex, and foreplay, when again he goes back into the idea of normalcy. But here he just mentions it, and he talks about the transgression pleasure. And this is very important. That much of the pleasure we derive is out of transgression. It is the no which multiplies the pleasure. So this is very important. In fact, Lacan later goes to the extreme to say that the no creates the desire. Now, partly it is true, but partly it is not true. There's also something called natural desire. Like Ayurveda talks about it, that if you were to accept completely your sexuality without any shame or guilt, and if you are living age-appropriate life with adequate satisfaction, then in how many days would you have a natural erection without any stimulation being provided to you? So people have done those kind of experiments, and they see that within a few days, there is a natural urge, there is a natural erection. People also talk about early morning erection even in children. So there is a natural desire which is not based upon transgression, but it is true that transgression multiplies natural desires and also creates a few desires. So it is the no which creates desire. Not all desires, it creates some desires and multiplies many desires. So there is a natural desire and there is a transgressive desire, desire created by or multiplied, the natural desire is multiplied by transgression. Now, this no, which is put by reality or morality, does two things. One, it creates new desires. Two, it multiplies natural desires in intensity and in scope. And three, very importantly, it leads to repression and all the vicissitudes that later happen. So it is the no which is at the heart of repression, which is at the heart of the transgressive pleasure. Now, this is very important in hypersexuality, in sexual disorders, or in addiction. A large part of pleasure of addiction is rooted in the no, the transgression. That people smoke cigarettes because it is the society says you should not smoke. So quite a substantial part of addiction is because of the transgressive pleasure, a no. And then Freud talks about that if we look at the sexuality of the sane and the sexuality of the insane, we don't see a radical departure. We see more commonality than differences. So slowly Freud is bringing bisexuality, homosexuality, foreplay, afterplay, anal sex, oral sex, transgressive pleasure within the fold of normalcy. And in order to put all of this together, he comes to two principles. The first is the principle of the sexual instinct versus sexual drive. That the instinct is natural, functional, and the drive is desire-based. And the desire has much to do with the no of the society. And second, he talks about, and this is where the drive is different from instinct. The instinct is for a minimum necessity. It is like needs and wants. The instincts are for needs and drives are for wants. One rough way to look at it. The second, he talks about that if we put all this deviation, we can put all the deviation under two groups. The deviation of sexual aim and the deviation of sexual object. When the sexual aim is not reproduction anymore, then what are the sexual aims? The sexual aims pertain to pleasure, domination, conquest, possession, revenge. All of this can get fused with sexuality. For example, if we look at the BDSM type of practice, it is all based upon domination, conquest, possession, sadism. All those things have got fused with sexuality. It's no longer the reproductive process anymore. It has got a very different aspect, a life of its own in the psyche. The biological part has been left far behind, and the complete psychological aspect is taken over. So he says, first deviation is related to the sexual aim. What is the aim of sexuality? If it is not reproduction, which is biological, then what are the psychological deviations? They are pleasure, domination, conquest, possession, revenge. The second deviation he talks is related to the object. That reproduction mandates heterosexual choice of object. And even within the heterosexual choice of object, only those women who are in the reproductive age. But if the sexual object choice deviates from this, then it is letting loose from the biological foundation and going into the psychic arena. And there one can have a choice of object may vary from the natural. A woman may select a woman, a man may select a man. A woman may select both men and women, man may select both men and women. And then there are fetishes, that something excites which from strict biological standpoint should not excite. This may be related to all the fetishes that we see, that strictly from a biological standpoint, all fetishes are deviations. And strictly from biological standpoint, even a foreplay and afterplay will be deviation. And then there are perversions, which can pertain to choice of animals or choice of children. So this he covers the first part of sexual aggression, sexual aberrations. Then it comes to very important idea of perversion. And this is where people pounce upon Freud of being very patriarchal, very rigid, and so on. So Freud asks the question, what is perversion? And he gives a biological definition. He says, any sexual activity not at the service of reproduction is a perversion. Now, this encompasses a large area of human activity. Because by this definition, foreplay will be a perversion. Any transgression of reality will be a perversion. Scopophilia, the pleasure derived by looking at something, that will be perversion. Fetishism will be perversion. Exhibitionism will be perversion. Voyeurism, sadism, masochism, all will be perversions. So Freud here takes a very strange stand. He calls all of this perversion and calls all of this universal. That the perversion does not mean it is exception in the human population. So it does not go by the law of averages. That if something is found in everybody, you cannot call it a disorder. He goes by a more Puritan way of right and wrong, of the normal and the pervert. It's like saying, if everybody has corona, does not mean corona is not a disease. Disease still remains a disease, even if everyone has it. So Freud goes by this even in other areas, like religion he calls the general neurosis of the species. That everyone has it, but does not mean it's not neurosis. So same way here, he calls all of this perversion, but he also realizes that everyone has it. Meaning a largest section of human population has it. And therefore anything except the regular sexual act is a perversion. And we are thrown into a dichotomy of reproduction on perversion. But since everyone has it, he says, man is polymorphously perverse. That the perversion is universal, Not only that, the man is polymorphously perverse, meaning there are many ways of deriving erotic pleasure apart from the regular reproductive act. And there are many zones in the body which are loaded with potential to produce pleasure, what he calls erotogenic zones. And because man derives pleasure from many of these erotogenic zones, and many of that has nothing to do with the act of reproduction, he calls man polymorphously perverse.
The paradigm of perversion as described by Freud came of help when we were working on pedophilia. That is when your sexual development is arrested at the level of that foreplay, maybe looking at, maybe touching, maybe, and in that fashion it was useful that this perversion, this arrest of the development is the final goal for them rather than the final genital union.
Correct. So here we see a very literal definition of perversion, a very biologically rooted literal definition. What later thinkers have done is they have metaphorized this and generalized it. Like what Lacan does is, and this is what Lacan does for most of Freud, he metaphorizes and generalizes. Right? Because once you metaphorize, the generalization scope is very large.
Mhm.
So the way later thinkers, including Lacan, have developed the idea of perversion is it is saying no to the limits of reality. That reality and morality put limits on our desire. And if we refuse to accept those limits of our desire, we are indulging in perversion. So it is not no longer than limited to any sexual activity. It is generalized to include the entire of human psychic behavior, psychic operation, where the moment the mind refuses to accept the limits of reality and morality, it's a transgression. And the transgression is a perversion.
That is where he used the term libidinal rather than sexual.
Yes, because when Freud uses the word sexuality, he uses it more in the Greek sense of the word erotica.
Uh-huh.
So it is not literally sexuality, it is actually a synonym of the earlier Greek origin word erotica. And that includes the entire domain of pleasure. And later on, it generalizes even more that it's not only pleasure, but it is the life instinct eros. So even if you are young and the forces of life are overcoming the forces of aging, that also is a triumph of the eros. And the old dying and new people being born can also be seen. What is uh, tragic for the individual is a celebration for the species, that a body which was captured by Thanatos is no longer there, and now a body bursting with eros has come in its place. So it's a very different conceptualization of it. And that is very different from the way Indian Tantra would look at it.
Okay.
Where they would try to perpetuate as far as possible the human life. Right? And they would do all sorts of alchemical experiments for it. Because even with belief of reincarnation, they still believe that the entire age from 0 till almost 2021, where unconscious has its rule, is actually a waste of time from spiritual evolution standpoint. And you take years to overcome what comes in those years inside of you. So actually, there is a very long period of being captured by the unconscious, largely speaking, and then many years spent in overcoming the capturing of the unconscious, and it's only then the real progress happens, which means in a lifetime you really get not more than 25-30 years to actually do some progress, right? From a spiritual point. So they have these ideas of how to prolong life and complete evolution without undergoing the unconsciousness of childhood and the wasted years and then traumatic years which have to be undone. Anyway. Then it comes to transformations at puberty. That once the ground is cleared for sexuality being a very important element in the psyche, sexuality being at the root of many psychic operations, some of which lead to pathology, and polymorphous perversion being universal in the species. After this discussion, he comes to puberty. What happens at puberty to sexuality? And he says, at puberty, the component instincts of, we have done component instincts before. We talked about exhibitionism, voyeurism, sadism, masochism. All these component instincts, instead of deriving their pleasure in an independent, autonomous way, now come under the overall organization of the genital organization. So instead of experiencing sadism all alone, standalone basis, now it becomes a part of sexuality and a minor part of sexuality. Right? So component instincts surrender to the overall genital organization. The perversions are weakened. The reproduction now becomes real. It's no longer masturbatory. It is real. Because the semen production has started or the ovulation has started. And the libido becomes stronger. So this is what happens at the puberty when the genital organization takes over. And we saw in the psychosexual phases, after the Oedipus, there is a latency period. And after the end of latency period, the genital period starts, where one becomes a real sexually active person capable of reproduction. So psychologically, this is what happens. Now, problem will happen if the component instincts don't surrender. Then what will happen is they will remain a major part on a standalone basis, and somebody will really turn out to be a sadist or a masochist or an exhibitionist or a voyeurist. So he says that this is very essential for a normal development of the psyche. Similarly, perversions are weakened. The polymorphously perverse organization gives way to a largely genital organization. And except the genital part, other eretogenic zones, they are weakened in terms of their capacity and in terms of intent of deriving pleasure from them. The reproduction becomes real and libido becomes stronger. What else happens in this puberty? These are very, very important for pathology. Reopening of unresolved problems that happens in puberty. That whatever problems are unsolved in 0 to 5, after the latency period, the hibernation period, again those unresolved packets are opened, and therefore you see a large component of chronic sicknesses start at puberty. If you look at chronic psychological sicknesses, you will see a predominant part of them start at puberty. Unresolved problems can also start, right? The packets can also be opened when you go to the first job, when you have the marriage, when you have children, or in midlife. These are also stressful situations of life where the unresolved packets of 0 to 5 can be reopened. But large reopening happens at puberty. But this is also true that many people have onset of sickness when they are about to take the first job, when they are about to get married or they get married, or when they have children. Uh, Actually, I saw a case where the husband lost all sexual interest in the wife and could no longer perform after the birth of the first child. And there were intense fights between the husband and wife because the wife could not be sexually satisfied. And suddenly the husband found that he was no longer able to have or sustain erection. And that is to do with the unresolved Oedipus. That the moment the wife becomes the mother of the child, now it connects in the unconscious to one's own mother. And then there is castration, anxiety, and guilt. That a completely sexually normal person, the moment his wife becomes a mother, is no longer a normal person. So the reopening of unresolved problems of 0 to 5 can happen at any of these points, but the most potent points are puberty and midlife. And puberty is the most potent. So I would say if you put percentages, it will be like 70% at puberty, 10% at midlife, another 20% distributed in the in between three or other challenging situations of life. Now, puberty is beginning of the young age, just as menopause is the end of the young age. And both these are, they bring with them crisis. So there is a psychological crisis at puberty and there is a psychological crisis at menopause. So there is a puberty crisis and there is a midlife crisis. One signals the start of the young age, second signals the end of the young age. So young age, both the starting and end points, they have psychic crisis associated with them. Midlife is where people undergo depression, anxiety, and often they enter into transgression because they realize it is now or never. Whatever unfulfilled desires are there, which you compromised with because of reality or morality, now it is either now or never. And if the desires are very strong, they cannot be mourned. You cannot do mourning of very strong desires. And therefore, many people go into extramarital affairs at midlife or separation from the wife at midlife because they feel they have compromised enough, they have repressed enough. It is now or never that they can live the way they want. And when you have now or never, many people opt for now. Some people opt for never. And those who opt for now, they enter into something that is transgression. Now we come to sexuality and resistance. That the sexuality that we talk of, it is not like having food or having clothes or something of that type. This is something very unique. It is loaded with superego. So it is one of the most heavily loaded instincts in terms of superego loading. So it's a very powerful instinct, but loaded equally with very heavy load of superego. That can be individual aspect of superego in the form of guilt or social aspect of superego in the form of shame. So what Freud says is that this instinct or this drive is also deeply entangled with shame, with disgust, with guilt, with anxiety. There is a mistake here. The swallow should be below. So let me just separate it so there is no confusion.
It's okay, sir.
So the ones in the red are what Freud talks about, and these are what Freud does not talk about. This I have added from work of other thinkers. So Freud says that the sexuality has a lot of resistance associated to it. It is not a simple thing to own up and express your sexuality, unlike many other instincts. So somehow this is an instinct which is heavily entangled and heavily repressed, and therefore involves guilt, shame, disgust, and anxiety. Now, what are the resistances which others have lined out, other thinkers after Freud? Sexuality, according to other thinkers, also is entangled with these more primary fears than Freud actually talked about. The fear of being swallowed in the huge body of the woman, that the man looks at the huge body of the woman, particularly the area of the stomach, and there is a fear of being swallowed into the stomach. It's a very psychotic fear. But some people will have it, and that will create anxiety related to sexuality. And this peculiar group will find it very difficult to have sexual relationship by sleeping over the woman. They can do it from the side or from the back, but they can't sleep over the woman, because that creates this whole anxiety of being swallowed. Very few people will have it in the mouth open, that when the mouth is open, there is a fear of being swallowed and chewed. But this is one more fear that is entangled with sexuality. There is another fear of vagina, where the fear is not of the whole of the human body, but particularly of vagina, where the fear is of being tortured, bitten off, what is called vagina dentata. That there are almost like very biting teeth-like structures in the vagina, and if the penis goes in, it will be bitten off in a very torturous way. And slowly I will also be sucked in, and I will also be tortured and miamed and bitten off. One of the Indian psychoanalysts, Sudhir Kakkar, has given a very good analysis of it. He says that the bad objects, the Kleinian bad objects, the most primitive Kleinian bad objects, often in the unconscious of the person, are put inside the vagina. And these primary bad objects of the earlier split not being resolved, they are put in the Oedipal stage into the vagina, psychically speaking, because of two reasons. One, it's a defense against the Oedipal desire. And two, because the sight of the vagina threatens, creates anxiety, it is seen as a very dangerous place, and therefore the mind surmises that probably it is difficult objects are inside, and therefore I am feeling anxious. So it can be a deduction or it can be a strategy, but either ways, you can have, psychically speaking, in the unconscious, very difficult objects put in the vagina, and this will create a very unique kind of erectile dysfunction. That the person will not have erectile dysfunction in the oral act, not in the anal act, but will have peculiarly only in the vaginal act. So very specific kind of erectile dysfunction. Then in some, there will be fear of merger, the whole body merging into the another body. That the ego will lessen in the sexual act, especially at the point of ejection, and there will be some moment of ego freedom, and one is terrified that what if I am just merged into the other. So we have here a contradictory human desire. There is an urge to merge, and there is a terror of merging. That if you look at human alienation, we feel as though we have been separated forcefully, pulled out of an organic unity with nature, and there is a desire to go back and finish off this alienation. At the same time, there is a terror of that merger. So on one hand, there is an urge to merge. On the other hand, there is a terror of the merger. That also is entangled with sexuality, the fear of it. The fear of the inferiority of the woman's body is seen as very huge and oneself seen as very small. Now, in reality, one may be a full-grown adult. We are not talking about a 15-year-old boy and a 35-year-old woman. It may even be a fully grown adult, but psychically he feels he is still a very small boy. And therefore, the hugeness of the body and the smallness of oneself, the inferiority of it, and the whole feeling of getting swallowed or somehow completely overwhelmed and annihilated by that hugeness. It may be just the fear of authority. Like in some cultures, women are very strong in the house, and boys grow up seeing a very dominating woman. And therefore, when they go in the sexual age, they find it very difficult to assert authority and sort of mount upon the woman. That whole act of mounting or taking on a stronger position against an authority figure is very, very difficult. In some countries like Japan, this is a very common psychoanalytic thing. When people grow with very dominating mothers. But this is not as serious a problem as the ones we listed before. This is a more a normal kind of issue. The others are very psychotic in nature. Then there can be a sadness or defeating, the sadness which comes by defeating or killing the father. That the act of sexuality can be confused with this. That the act of actual successful sexual activity is seen as an Oedipal triumph in the unconscious, and therefore is loaded with sadness of defeating or killing the father. And some guilt also related to it. And of course, the guilt of the Oedipus. The three are there. So Freud talks about sexuality involved with resistances. It is not a free instinct. And you can see how difficult the resistances are. They can be something very normal, going to the neurotic, going to the psychotic. Now, how does it play up in psychoanalysis? Because sexuality is involved with superego of the individual and the society. And some will say the two are not different, they are very connected to each other. The individual superego reflects a great deal the social superego. So, sexuality in psychoanalysis is wound up with repression as a phenomenon. Once it is repressed, it undergoes vicissitudes, distortions, and much of it can be sublimated into something acceptable by society. And therefore, in pathogenesis, it plays a very strong role. That in a large number of disorders, sexuality will be involved in the pathogenesis. And once it is, and it's also involved in healing. The Oedipus has not yet come. The libido is still the primary erotic energy and converts into everything else. The death energy still has not come in Freudian articulation, but it is a very early stage. And then Freud talks about infantile sexuality. And this is a very important part, that Culture believed that we become sexually active only at puberty. But Freud says actually we are sexually active right from early days. That reproductive sexuality is not the only sexuality. Sexuality is much wider than reproductive sexuality. And interpreted in those terms, infantile sexuality is a fact of life, which is very difficult for most people to accept. And Freud brings about certain issues like we see erection in children, we see masturbation in children, and we see anger towards parents if they come too close in children. So the child is very much a lover and a sexually active individual in the larger sense of the word. And we also see something which is infantile defenses. That even at such an early age, the superego is already active. Now, Freud later said that this was retrospective, meaning he said, according to Freud, the superego comes into existence only at the end of the Oedipus complex. And then there is a retrospective application of that superego onto the pre-Oedipal material. But most people believe, and I agree with them, that defenses predate Oedipus. That guilt and shame actually come far earlier than Oedipus, and maybe they are inborn. I think most of the people believe, I agree, that they are probably inborn. And therefore, we see infantile defenses. In fact, I was analyzing dreams, and some people brought me dreams of their children when they were around 1.5 to 2 years of age. Let me say 1.5 to 3 years of age. To be more precise, say around 2 to 3. Let me say 2 to 3, no doubt about it. And in their dreams, we can see defenses. In the dreams of children who can speak, much before the Oedipus, we can see defenses. We can see the superego operation. So, which means that there are infantile defenses much earlier than Freud said. And so we say there is infantile sexuality, there is infantile defenses, infantile superego, and infantile root of pathology. That the core of adult pathology is often infantile, which activates at puberty or activates when you are presented with a challenging role in transition in the program of life, like you're making a transition from a non-reproductive sexual person to a reproductive sexual person. You are transiting from a student to a job, unmarried to married, not a father to a father, pre-midlife to post-midlife. So the adult pathology can start in any of these points, but usually the core is always in infantile pathology. Now, where else do you see the infantile part? We see in thumb sucking. We see in children pleasuring themselves. We see children playing with their erotogenic zones. And we also see very early sublimation and reaction formation. These two defenses along with repression. Yeah, you're saying something.
No, sir. I was not saying something to you particularly. I was requesting our receptionist to get coffee for me because I needed to be awake.
That he brings in the Havelock Ellis and done some work on autoeroticism. That one can treat one's own body as an object of pleasure. And one can deposit one's libido in one's autoeroticism. And Freud made use of this in narcissism later on. That the libido, instead of cathecting the object, cathects oneself. Freud also says that children have a great knack and instinct for sexual knowledge. Like they inevitably ask, where do babies come from? Are they in the stomach? Why are they in the stomach? They are fascinated by absence or presence of penis, and they start thinking why this has happened. And this, according to him, gives rise to the castration complex and penis envy. That the boy child fears that he might be castrated because he believes the girl child has been castrated. And the girl child believes that probably I was castrated, I don't have what he has, and therefore there is envy of the penis. And then Freud comes to a brief description of the oral, anal, Oedipal, and genital stage, what we call the psychosexual development. So it makes its first appearance in this monograph. And Freud talks about the pre-genital organization, influence of early impressions, and fixation. That very early in life, one can have fixation about the type of women one likes or transitional objects. So this is very important. The type of women you have seen early in life or the type of men women have seen very early in life, they have a particular kind of liking developed in the mind, which is very different from your later preferences. So there is actually a hodgepodge. There is your own liking. There is a search for the parents. There is a search for the idealized version of the parents. And there is search for the ones you saw in the childhood. And often one is confused between them. And one catches hold of one and finds the others missing. Because one is collectively in search of everything, and at times they are mutually exclusive. I'll give an example. Somebody told me this. That person was in police department. And the person said that people, even at the level of IG, DG, they fall for some of the police constables who are women. And if you look at them, you can't see anything. Why should somebody risk so much at an age where the children are about to get married? The kind of social shame it would bring upon the man would be enormous. Then how is it that a very intelligent person who has passed IPS, who has seen the world, who has risen to this rank, who is very intelligent in one way, very worldly wise in other ways? You can't rise to those ranks without being worldly wise. So we are not dealing with an impractical scientist. We are dealing with an extremely intelligent, well-educated, worldly wise person. Then why he would fall for this? What force inside his mind is not allowing his logic to operate? And often the force at work is this. The type of women he has seen in very early life, he feels very differently at home with them. The kind of at-home feeling he will never have anywhere else. So that is a very different thing. And once you cross 45, this force actually multiplies. One starts longing more and more for what one experienced in early childhood. And one is no longer carried away by the contemporary marketing, brands, or events. So 15 to 35 is where one is blinded by the contemporary. And 35 to 45, the weaning away happens from the contemporary. And after 45, one largely has a very strong element of living in the past. And it's very natural. And one lives in the past in different ways, either in memory or by reconnecting with one's school friends or by going to one's school in alumni associations or going to places he used to go to in childhood. And the extreme of it is there are many communities which migrate from village to the city to work. And when they become old and they are about to die, they request that they should be taken back to their village. And they are actually carried by family members to the village to facilitate dying. So they don't care for the medical help available in the city. It's a very strong psychological desire to have a closure, to end where it began. And that closure is psychologically very satisfying, very deeply satisfying. So this reliving in the past, living in the past, going back to the past is a very natural closure movement. And that can happen naturally or also by fixation. One can also have fixation on transitional objects of childhood. That you will find in some people, the transitional objects like the doll or a towel or some clock, people are just not able to give it up. Wherever they go, they want to have the transitional object with them. There is a fixation upon the transitional object. In fact, I know a girl, when she got married, she carried her teddy bear even to the in-laws' house. So in some cases, the fixation of transitional objects is so high, one can't just get out. But all of these are products of the infantile age. Where do you see sexuality pervading pathology? In anxiety disorders. You can see at the root of many anxiety disorders is castration anxiety, gender orientation, paraphilic disorders, any area where aggression is too much in sexuality, any area, any disorder where guilt and disgust is associated with sexuality, and all sorts of perversion. Also, early life infantile sexuality is associated with, now this is all what Freud would say. Now, non-Freudian thinkers will add the fear of torture, the fear of merger, engulfment, loss, shame, envy, inferiority, autoeroticism, sexual addiction. These are also the areas when they are involved, you can have infantile sexuality in some way, and pre-infantile sexuality areas, the pre-sexual areas also involved here. So here, sexual areas, sexual issues and pre-sexual issues both are involved. And here, largely sexual, early life infantile sexuality is. This is also infantile, but non-sexual part of infantile experiences plus some part of infantile sexual experiences. So this is how, yeah.
Why should there be disgust in sexuality?
It can be a defense against Oedipal castration. Right? Or the disgust is felt because of one's guilt. Because disgust is strongly related to guilt. In fact, in ISTDP videos, if you see, when one actually feels guilt in the chest area, one feels almost a nauseating, disgusting feeling. And in dreams, often it comes out in the symbolism of the rat, the dirty rat. So the dirty rat often symbolizes the dirty Oedipal feelings, and the teeth of the rat often symbolizes the fear of Oedipal castration.
Sir.
Any questions? We are on time.
It's really in-depth, and I learned many things again about Freudian infantile sexuality.
So it slowly builds up. This is like a foundation. And from here you start the psychosexual stages and then go into the real applied theory. This is like the creation of the ingredients of the real theory which you see applied. This is like a build-up of theory period for Freud.
Okay. Thank you, sir.